Aren't you lucky that I put on lipstick really poorly for this? Hi everybody, it's been a little bit of a while, It's because I'm back at university, and you know when you're doing a double load of subjects you tend to procrastinate by making videos where you talk about Irene Adler for 20 minutes. I know I said in my last elementary versus Sherlock video that I would be talking about Professor Moriarty and how he is represented in elementary and Sherlock. But I changed my mind because a lot of people were messaging me asking me to make one about Irene Adler, and this is probably because I have a reputation on Tumblr for being in love with Irene Adler. It's all true. Okay, so let's go elementary or Sherlock. So Irene Adler made her first appearance in 1891 in the story A Scandal in Bohemia. The King of Bohemia rocks up to 221B and says to Sherlock he needs Sherlock to go and attain these sensitive letters and photos that Irene Adler has that basically shows that he was having an affair. Can't get them himself because Irene Adler refuses to take bribes. Holmes, in all his misogynistic and cocky dickhead glory that we love most of the time, says that it should be a cinch because she's a lady, and he and Dr. Watson head over to Irene Adler's house. Holmes is in disguise as a priest, and Watson basically causes a small explosion, during the kerfuffle of which Sherlock grabs what he thinks are the letters. But when they get back to 221B, he opens the envelope to find simply a letter from Irene Adler saying, haha, got you back, thought that you could get me, but I saw you coming a mile away, boy. And she basically says that, you know, in another life I might have dated you, you're alright looking, but I got shit to do, man, so nice to meet you. Tell the king that I'm gonna keep all this shit. And Sherlock handles this pretty gracefully. He says to the king, you know what, my bad, I screwed up, I assumed because she was a woman she was stupid. I just want to keep this letter though. The story sort of ends with Watson sort of reflecting, saying, oh, you know, Holmes doesn't really involve himself with romantic stuff, but ever since Irene Adler he has stopped making fun of women. Wow. In this entire story though, it is important to know that we never actually encounter Irene Adler as an audience. She is only ever sort of impressed upon us by the males in the story. This is one of the reasons why she is so often characterized so differently. The King of Bohemia obviously perceives her as an enemy because she has this information. Holmes is obviously quite intrigued by her, like, holy shit, this woman isn't dumb. So what do we know about Irene Adler for sure? What is her role in Holmes' mythology? Well, the only thing we really know for certain is that Irene Adler is the only adversary who outsmarted Sherlock Holmes. The only one. And that this defeat has some kind of long-term behavioural effect on Sherlock, and that it's a positive one. Literally Irene Adler schooling Sherlock Holmes in his misogyny. She forced him to realise that women were human beings. That's why she's my gal. But it is also really important to remember that in this story, neither of them express anything that could be considered explicitly romantic, nor do they engage in anything that could be considered explicitly romantic. It's referred to as the late Irene Adler, and whether or not you interpret that as, well, she's dead, or, ooh, she probably got married so she's not known as Irene Adler anymore, that's pretty definitive. Like, it's pretty much saying, like, she's not Irene Adler anymore, she's not interacting with them as Irene Adler anymore. So the question becomes, why is she then always pinned as Sherlock's love interest in most of the adaptations that she features in? Well, there's lots of reasons. That Arthur Conan Doyle used very flowery language that is very much considered romantic by today's linguistics. Two is, well, homophobia, because a lot of people just use Irene Adler to make sure that, you know, people don't think that he's gay. Nothing about that situation is something that I like. Or, well, yeah, look, sexism. Nearly every version of Irene Adler is either portrayed as someone who is Sherlock's enemy or someone who is his damsel in distress. Which is interesting because she was neither of those things to him in her original form. She has fallen victim over the last 120 plus years to a trope that I like to call the men done good. Now the men done good trope works in two ways. The first one goes like this. Man has deep-seated issues with either sexism, racism, or some other issue, or all of these issues at once. A woman then comes along and shows him that he can be a better person and forces him to reform his behavior, and then for some reason falls in love with him because he's not a shit person anymore. Look, he is in love with a woman, so he can't be sexist. The second way this trope works is much, much simpler. It is simply, men is good because women clearly bad. This male character can't be bad because look at this female character, she did worse thing, so man done good by not doing worse thing. Irene Adler has fallen victim to this trope countless times, and what's worse, often writers place emphasis on her romantic feelings towards Holmes, which, may I remind you, don't actually canonically exist, instead of placing the emphasis on his change as a character. That completely negates her purpose in the first place. The Lord knows that I love me some Irene Adler and Sherlock Holmes love, but if that relationship comes at the cost of Irene Adler losing her autonomy as a character, then I don't want it. When she is put in that relationship with Sherlock Holmes, it is really rare that she is then actually made to fulfill her purpose of developing his character. And often her own character development also suffers because she is simply just like, oh well, she's in love with him, that's about it. Neither of those things are something that the Conan Doyle version of her did, which is interesting because, I mean, she was a Victorian woman. I mean, if you want to talk about women who were oppressed, Victorian London is a place where you would not want to live and not want to go. Literally, there was shit in the streets. The idea that Irene Adler in the Arthur Conan Doyle stories is a more well-rounded woman than the versions in the modern stories is a little bad. The version of Irene Adler that we know and love in the Arthur Conan Doyle version was relatively revolutionary. Nothing romantic had to occur between her and Sherlock Holmes in order for him to respect her as a human being. Nor did the fact that she outsmarted him impact his respect for her in a negative way. No one should be holding up Sherlock Holmes as the icon for feminism, but I just want to put it out there that Sherlock Holmes is a character who clearly doesn't have a single bone in his body made of toxic masculinity. And that is pretty cool. Irene Adler should represent positively something that Sherlock perceives as negative. So as much as your version of Sherlock depends on what your version of John Watson values, your version of Irene Adler depends greatly upon the depth and complexity of Sherlock's fears and faults. Irene's purpose in the original canon was essentially to embody the change that Sherlock Holmes needed to wake up to without necessarily involving herself romantically with him or losing her own autonomy. If you write a version of Sherlock Holmes who is afraid of snakes, then your Irene Adler should be someone who loves reptiles, for instance, a reptile wrangler, and she should show Holmes that snakes aren't that bad without actually having to get involved with his snake, if you knew what I mean. I won't do that anymore, that's just... So the question becomes now, does Elementary and Sherlock fulfill this in their versions of Irene Adler? When it comes to BBC Sherlock, the answer is... on face value, Lara Pulver's version of Irene Adler does tick all the boxes. Benedict's version of Sherlock Holmes represses his emotions both sexually wise and romantic wise. Actually, in general, he's a very repressive person. It's not really that healthy. He believes that those emotions are unworthy of his work. So naturally, Lara Pulver's version of Irene Adler is a dominatrix, someone who essentially embodies like all of that, all those fears. Everything Lara Pulver's version of Irene Adler does to outsmart Benedict's version of Sherlock is centered around dismantling his prejudices towards romantic feelings and feelings of sexuality by directly confronting him with those issues. That is where it gets a little tricky. In theory, Irene Adler is meant to show Holmes the errors of his ways without actually engaging him romantically. The reason it gets tricky when it comes to Lara Pulver's version is that she has to engage with him romantically in order to show him his role. But that's just it. When she goes through the motions, which would have been fine if that's all they were, it's revealed that she actually develops feelings for him. This wouldn't be as bad as I think it is if they hadn't made her out to be a gay character and then had her attracted to Sherlock. I mean, I don't know if that's homophobic or biphobic, but either way, I don't like it. In the end, Sherlock uses Irene's supposed feelings for him to essentially remove her autonomy as a character and basically completely undermine what she is meant to achieve in terms of being in Sherlock Holmes. While Sherlock's rescue of her does show that he has learned that, hey, romantic attachment isn't that bad, the fact remains that this change comes at the cost of Irene's autonomy as a character, as beyond that, beyond his rescue of her, we know nothing about what happens. Not only is she never actually seen by us again, she is only ever reflected on or referenced to in relation to Sherlock's affections, which, as I've said in previous versions, he neglects. The idea that this woman who once had the nation on its knees, who had outsmarted Sherlock, not only does this completely undermine her character, but it also completely negates anything that Sherlock was meant to have learned from her. The fact that he can sit there and not text her back means that he has not actually learned that romantic attachment is a thing, which was essentially what Lara Pulver's Irene Adler was meant to do. It also paints her as submissive to him, which is something I think we can all agree is not really what Irene Adler is about. It goes, man done good this one time so he doesn't have to do good on the other times. Yeah. Moffat and Gaddis, despite starting off with an Irene Adler that had so much promise, failed to deliver on a character that is anything other than a shallow representation. So, what about Elementaries? Elementaries' Irene Adler is quite interesting because she takes on a lot of different roles and either subverts them or completely rejects them. Throughout Elementaries' 5 seasons, Irene Adler takes on many of the roles that often other adaptations are limited to. Has at one point been Sherlock's lover, victim, enemy, mentor. She has at some point in Elementary embodied all of the things that Irene Adlers have been in the past. Elementary treats Irene Adler like a nuanced person. When we first learn of Irene Adler in Elementary, she's Sherlock's dead lover, the one that caused him to overdose and move to New York and restart his life. Later on, we learn that she's actually alive and been held by Moriarty this entire time, and after a series of quite complicated events, we find out that in actual fact, Irene Adler was Moriarty this entire time, and she has been manipulating Sherlock because she thinks it's fun. But when she admits to actually developing feelings for him, he uses that to expose her. That might sound familiar, because it's essentially what happened in BBC Sherlock. The difference, though, between BBC Sherlock and this is that in Elementary, the story doesn't stop there. Through her own resourcefulness, Jamie escapes from prison. Holmes tracks her down, observing that she is less violent than usual, and she essentially admits that as much as she changed him, he has also changed her. She is re-imprisoned again, but escapes and keeps in contact with both Sherlock and Joan individually. We can see that Elementary did in fact fill Irene Adler's initial purpose of changing something about Sherlock, but they took this even further by making her a character in her own right, as well as someone who is intrinsically linked to Sherlock. So I know what you're thinking, how did they do it? I said before that the base of Irene Adler's character should be she embodies something that Sherlock needs to change about himself. You look at Sherlock in BBC Sherlock and in theory, his complete disregard for romance and desire is negated by the fact that Irene Adler comes along and she's all dominatrixy and sexy and he realizes, oh shit. So she must embody the change that Sherlock's character needs. But what Elementary did that many other versions of Sherlock Holmes didn't was that they didn't stop there. Yes, Elementary's Sherlock, like many, didn't see a point to romantic entanglement. Although it's interesting because Sherlock in Elementary is quite a sex-positive version, which is cool too, but he didn't see a value in romantic entanglement. Irene Adler changed that about him, but the Elementary team didn't see a reason for her impact on Sherlock to stop there, or for his impact on her to stop there. Jamie shows Sherlock how much he has changed when it comes to his sobriety, his value of human connection, especially in relation to Joan. And she does this without compromising her own integrity. She tells Sherlock that she has learnt to value human life more because of his work. And this character development doesn't necessarily happen because they are or were in love with each other. It happens because they are both flawed individuals who learn from each other. They both value each other and learn from what they value of each other. That's called being a human being. Irene Adler's original purpose was to be a character that prompted Sherlock to change his attitude and ways. But Irene Adler in Elementary is not portrayed as a character whose sole purpose is that. The Elementary writers moved her beyond that purpose without compromising that purpose. Her existence in Elementary is flawed and nuanced, and more importantly, actually there. I'm just saying, Mind Palace shit don't count. Unlike other adaptations of Irene Adler, and when I say other, I mean most, Jamie is not Sherlock's reward. She is not Sherlock's damsel, and nor is she really his enemy. Basically, in Elementary, she's human. And that might not be what Arthur Conan Doyle ever expected Irene Adler to be. But in my opinion, after 125 years of misogynistic bullshit, it is about time that my girl got a decent go at being a character, rather than just a plot point to prove that Holmes isn't gay, to teach Holmes to be a decent human being, or be something like eye candy. Okay, so that I haven't actually touched on Sherlock's sexuality, and that is more or less because I don't really care about it that much. And that took me a long time to realize, but I just don't care. And the reason I don't care is because neither does he. Sherlock Holmes is married to his work, and he values friendship. He values goodness in people. But you know what he doesn't value? Sex. And that's one of the reasons why Sherlock Holmes has always been an important character to me, because I am someone who also doesn't really value sex or romantic attachments. I love my friends, I love my family, I love learning and sharing, but I don't really care about sex that much. And sex has never been something that's impacted Holmes' character a lot. Irene Adler didn't make an impact on Sherlock Holmes because he was sexually attracted to her. She made an impact because she proved him wrong about women being idiots. Holmes' point as a character was not to be this gay icon or an asexual icon or this James Bondy type dude. His point was to show us see good in people and always be the good that we want to see in people. Your mind is always your greatest weapon. You don't have to be physically strong or handsome or anything like that. Yeah, so that's me. Hope that that was enlightening. Next time I will be talking about Professor Moriarty. Professor Moriarty. I hope you enjoyed this video. I, for one, loved talking about my girl Irene Adler. Probably it came as a bit of a shock to everyone to find out, you know, I don't actually place so much value on Sherlock's romance with Irene Adler. It's really just something I enjoy writing about. I think they're both really cool characters and they have the potential to do cool things together. I'm allowed. Anyway, much peace, much love to all of you. I hope that you all have excellent weeks and I will see you next time. Don't forget to like and subscribe or neither or whatever. Bye!